Another question I had was just on a more policy level. The discussion of reparations has been brought up recently. In the Democratic primary, the subject was broached by the likes of Marianne Williamson, who made a great case for the policy. But however, reparations are usually framed and discussed within the context of addressing America's history with slavery and repairing the wound between white and black communities. Reparations are less discussed in the context of Native communities and our country's long history of breaking treaties with Native communities and oppressing the indigenous peoples. How would you envision an adequate government response to address the needs of Native communities and help repair our history of displacement and ethnic cleansing in a way that would actually, address the people's need and get help to those who need it in the disenfranchised communities of our country?
Yeah, so in regards to reparations for slavery, I absolutely believe that reparations are owed. Labor was stolen, people were dehumanized, and reparations need to be paid. One of the things I've been advocating since the beginning of my campaign is when you file a class action lawsuit, right, and you're a part of a lawsuit, and normally those lawsuits never go to court, they get settled out of court, and you've been part of that class action lawsuit. In order to go claim your piece of whatever the was won in the settlement, you normally have to sign a paper saying that you are now putting this legal matter to rest and you are waiving a right to sue over this issue again. This is how class action lawsuits work almost 90% of the time, especially when they're regarding large corporations and huge amounts of people and very raw injustice. And so what I've been trying to say to the African American community within our country, I absolutely agree reparations are due and they need to be paid. But because the 13th Amendment doesn't abolish slavery, it just redefines and codifies it under the jurisdiction of the criminal justice system. What it says is neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, wherever the party has been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States. We've never abolished slavery. This is one of the reasons why these lynchings and murders like George Floyd or these shootings like Jacob Blake happen, is because the Constitution systemically protects slavery within our Constitution. It institutionalizes white supremacy within our criminal justice system. And so what I've been advocating for is if the African American community allows the United States government to pay reparations before it actually abolishes slavery, I can almost promise you slavery will never be abolished, right? Just like when you settle a class action lawsuit, if you want the payment, you have to promise to never sue over this issue again, and the US government will do everything they can to put this matter to rest. And so I'm advocating that let's abolish slavery. Let's actually get rid of the injustice, and then immediately, or even in conjunction with that, let's talk about what do we need to do to right this wrong. Now, that is the African American, I'm not going to put everyone into one group, but there are many people within the African American community who are advocating for reparations, and it is their right, and I believe they are owed. The Native community has a much different issue. You can almost, and they try to quantify the injustice against African American people. And they can almost begin to quantify the labor that was stolen. They don't even attempt to quantify the dehumanization and the oppression that was enacted against African people who were brought here and enslaved. But for Native peoples, the injustice is almost unquantifiable. When you look at the ethnic cleansing, the genocide, the stolen treaties, the stolen land, it is almost unquantifiable. I love what happened with the Lakota people in South Dakota, where the US government stole one of their sacred mountains, Mount Rushmore, and they carved the faces of some of their most white supremacist and genocidal presidents into those mountains. Later, they felt bad and they went back and they said to the Lakota people, we would like to pay for these mountains. And they offered money. And the Lakota people said they're not for sale. There is literally about $1 billion sitting in a trust fund right now that the Lakota people refuse to touch because they refuse to sell these mountains to the United States of America. One of the things that so many Native nations are fighting for is a nation-to-nation relationship with the US government, is sovereignty over their own lands. Just last week, as you stated earlier, not last week, last month, as you stated earlier, the United States government has been breaking treaties with Native nations for its entire existence. In the Supreme Court case just a month and a half ago, McGirt versus the state of Oklahoma, which many people saw as a win for McGirt and for the Creek Nation, because they were arguing, had the eastern half of Oklahoma been disestablished as reservation lands, and the lower courts ruled that they had, and the Supreme Court reversed the ruling and ruled in favor of the Creek Nation and McGirt and said, no, the state of Oklahoma cannot disestablish reservation lands. The courts cannot disestablish reservation lands. And just because white settlement moved in, that does not disestablish reservation lands. So they reversed the ruling and said the eastern half of Oklahoma essentially is still reservation land, at least for judicial purposes of what needs to happen in court. However, they repeated numerous times, and it was Neil Gorsuch, who is one of the leading experts on American Indian law, on the Supreme Court, and he wrote that opinion. And with the majority opinion, even Ruth Bader Ginsburg signed off on it. And throughout that opinion, probably 6 or 7 times, the Supreme Court stated and restated that any time the United States Congress decides, and they actually said can muster the will, it has the right to disestablish reservation lands and break treaties with Native nations, and there's nothing anyone can do to hold them accountable about that. Even the Supreme Court will not hold them accountable. It was the first time, and while we know the government has broken treaties throughout its past, this is the first time I've actually read that the United States Supreme Court ruled that the Congress has the right to break treaties. Even though the Constitution says treaties are the supreme law of the land, the Supreme Court ruled that the US Congress has the right to break treaties, and there's nothing anyone can do to hold them accountable for it. This is one of the issues of what so many Native nations are advocating for and fighting for, which is they want to have a true nation-to-nation relationship. They want to have sovereignty over their own land, or at least what Europeans call sovereignty. They want to be able to actually make decisions about the lands that they had or that they reside on now, that they have treaties for. And so when you talk reparations with Native peoples, what it tries to do is it tries to frame the injustice as something that happened in an isolated moment in the past that can now be corrected through a payment, which is not true. It's an ongoing thing that to this day, 6 weeks ago, the Supreme Court stated that essentially before the US Congress, Native nations have absolutely no rights. And that issue needs to be dealt with much differently. And that's, I think, what many Native nations are going to be advocating for and working towards. And this is why, as a candidate for president, one of the things I'm advocating for is I am actually interested in going back and revisiting the treaties that were signed. And let's actually keep the word. If the US government signed these treaties, let's keep our word and honor our treaty obligations. Let's work to make these things just and enforceable rather than just ignore them because we feel we have the right to.